Well, good evening to you all, and especially those students who've come here this evening after exams. You get extra marks for being here after the point in which you absolutely had to. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome Craig Calhoun to University College and to Durham University. He'll speak, as the title suggests, on human suffering and humanitarian response. Craig, as you all know, is director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, a job he started last year in September. It goes without saying, especially for me, who was part of the LSE for 12 years, that it is one of the finest, if not the finest, centers of social science, education, and research in the world. To be a director of the LSE, to lead the LSE, is an incredible privilege. And yet there is nobody better, I think, around now on this planet than Craig Calhoun to take that role. So it's fantastic for the LSE that he's there. It's great for us that he's here this evening, and it's a particular pleasure for me. From 1999, just to fill you in, to 2012, Craig was president of the Social Science Research Council in the USA, where he made a very major impact. Before that, he taught at the universities of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and at NYU, New York University. Craig is a passionate champion of using social science to address pressing public concerns. But his work is very wide-ranging. I'm not going to mention all the topics he's written on, but it's culture, communications, humanitarianism, social movements, tort law, risk, among many other subjects. He has written over 100, I love these statistics, over 100 scholarly articles and chapters, and published numerous books. I'm just going to mention some of them. Nations Matter, Nationalism, Critical Social Theory, and more recently edited books of the title Rethinking Secularism and Practicing Culture. It's an incredible pleasure for me to have him here. I think it's great to have him in Durham. Please give him a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Well, it's a terrific pleasure for me to be here. I was tempted just to stay sitting down. It was so comfortable, and looking at this absolutely grand room. It's an honor to be with you. It's an honor to be invited by David Held. I think he's trying to make it up to me that I thought when I took this job at the LSE I was going to have David Held as a colleague, which would have been a great selling point, but he's invited me up here to at least have a short visit and see the wonderful surroundings. We don't have any rooms like this at the LSE. What I want to talk about tonight is something that has flourished, been important, and I think often been seen as one of the most ethically pure and compelling things that one could do or be, humanitarian. This is actually a term that's older. It's really flourished in the 19th century. I'll say something briefly. But in the last 30 or 40 years, the idea of humanitarian assistance, of response to humanitarian emergencies, has become a very big thing in the world. It's a big business in a sense. There are millions and millions of pounds worth of activity. There's even a trade fair, the Humanitarian Trade Fair in Dubai. You can get your treated mosquito nets and so forth. But it's an activity that draws people because of a sense of ethical commitment. And it's an activity, I think, characteristic of its period, and one which is interestingly complicated. It's not quite as simple as that first idea suggests. Suffering isn't a new phenomenon. Humanitarian action is often explained as though it's what you do to help people who are suffering, of course. But throughout history, people have suffered without anything like the modern sort of humanitarian response, without even the conceptualization of humanity or humanitarian action. The reasons why there's suffering, the various sorts of bad things, from natural disasters to technological failures to wars and conflicts, have gone on in many settings at many times. And they are part of the story because they do create occasions for humanitarian action as collateral damage of war, after the meltdown of a nuclear reactor, after a tsunami. There are people who are displaced and suffering and people who try to help them. Okay? But something is more specific than that. In 1755, famously, Lisbon was largely destroyed by an earthquake. An earthquake, if you're familiar with it at all, you probably know from its appearance in Voltaire's Candide. The earthquake was interpreted largely, as this painting with its allegorical angels and so forth will figure, it is interpreted in terms of divine will, in terms of the corruption of the city and the reasons why God visited this disaster on it, and in terms of who was saved or lost in the earthquake, a different register for thinking about it. This was clearly a disaster in the same sense in which we have modern disasters, but it wasn't an emergency in quite the same sense. Britain did send aid. This is at the transitional period of the very beginning of modern international relations and things like aid. The aid from Britain, the first aid, reached Lisbon about 3 months after the disaster. The traveling of engravings that would show this began in about 6 weeks. So it wasn't simultaneous. It wasn't the same sense of currency that was going on, the illicit charity, right? What we have to think about, I want to suggest, is what it is that makes distant suffering compelling to people, makes it something that elicits action, not just sympathy, not just pity, not just concern, but action, doing something. Why is it that we understand obligations to humanity as a whole? People haven't always thought that they had any obligation to people outside their social group, however that group was defined. And why does the action seem urgent? Now, not everything has changed. Right? You may recall Sharon Stone saying that the Sichuan earthquake in China was because of China's bad karma over the treatment of Tibet. Right? You may recall John Hagee, an advisor to John McCain when he was a presidential candidate, who said that New Orleans suffered the hurricane and damage because of the sexual decadence of the city, and that this was God's wrath. So things similar to what were said in 1755 in Lisbon haven't disappeared from our consciousness. The main part of it. We don't mainly blame disasters, as the name would suggest, as the word would suggest, on the stars. We don't think a misalignment of the stars produces disasters. What we believe in are material causes to a large extent, and the capacity materially to act, to help. Okay? So there are choices about how to help. Do you try to reform a system, in some sense, to change world affairs, political and economic power, or do you try to mitigate suffering immediately? Now, they're not contradictory. You can do both. It's hard to do both at the same time, and there's a choice. Right? I won't show the map, and I won't go into this part of the research, but humanitarian disasters and suffering from humanitarian disasters is overwhelmingly concentrated in poor countries. Right? When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, right, there were 3 deaths initially. There was very little mortality, very little morbidity compared to when similar sorts of events take place in third world countries. Routine flooding, nearly routine flooding in Bangladesh has more mortalities every time. Okay? So you might say, I'm not going to work on flood relief, I'm going to work on preparation in advance for this. But what's happened is a very large channeling of resources, not into prevention, but into mitigation of suffering after each event. And you might work on a long-term struggle to change social organization. Right? You might say we have to change the way society is organized. Some of you will know Amartya Sen's famous work on famines, showing that in democratic societies, many fewer people die when there's a famine. Food is redistributed better. So you might say bringing democracy is the answer, not bringing food after a famine. What is it? Is it the urgent response? Is it long-term? And what about distant suffering? The very category, the idea that the concern is distant. And it's actually sort of odd. In the 18th century, thinkers like David Hume and Adam Smith assumed that we would simply have less concern the farther away people were from us. We would read about an earthquake in China, and we would say, that's bad, but we wouldn't lose any sleep over it. We would have much less sense of joining in the suffering, sharing the suffering, than if we hurt the little finger on our hand. So they assumed just concentric circles of distance. But what we find now is often people are quite able to live in a rather posh residential area just next to a terribly depressed area, not worry about that, but send money to save the children to help those who are suffering in Darfur. So we have a very different kind of relationship spatially to this. There are choices. There are a variety of choices, and we can think differently about them. And one of those differences is between thinking, as it were, politically and ethically. Thinking in terms of a larger political project that will, among other things, require working with a lot of other people to bring about an outcome, because political change isn't something that individuals can generally produce. Or thinking in an ethical framework, how can I be a good person in this world that produces so much suffering? And this is all shaped, I want to suggest, by historical contexts and what I would call social imaginaries, ways we think about the world that actually shape the world and shape how we take hold of it. It's not just imagined, but it's how we make it real, by what ways we think of it. Now, I'm not going to go through all possible angles of this. I'll probably talk too much, but I won't try to talk as much as I could. And I want to try to get a few specific features of this fleshed out. I'm going to start with this idea of an emergency imaginary, as I've called it. The very idea that emergencies depend on how we imagine them. Remember I said at the beginning the Lisbon earthquake was a disaster. There was terrible suffering, horrible things happened. It wasn't an emergency. It wasn't an emergency partly because no one thought of it that way. No one had that category, and no one had the capacity to act immediately at a distance, to behave as we think people behave in emergencies. The emergency imaginary involves thinking of a class of events called emergencies, which we believe are sudden, unpredictable, short-term, exceptions to some kind of order. Right? The emergency, a key idea for us is that the emergency is the exception. It's not an emergency that there is great poverty in Mali. Right? That's a state of affairs. Right? It's an emergency when the state of affairs changes suddenly in a way that causes suffering. And the idea is that it compels response. We believe that when there's an emergency, you have to do something. So we have various zones. We have accident and emergency wards in hospitals, and we have various areas. We have financial emergencies, and much of the same sort of thinking goes into understanding the idea of a financial emergency. It's not just a market downturn. It's a sudden, unpredictable, short-term exception to the general rule, which is that markets ought to go up, and it compels response, and political leaders run around trying to do something, whether they know what to do or not. There's an ideology to this that is significant, this ideology of the short-term exception. So we see an example of the emergency in Palestine, an emergency that has existed since the conflict that led to the creation of Israel. So that there is still a UN agency administering refugee camps under the emergency acts that were created at the time, 1940, or the Indian partition, an emergency. Right? An emergency that happened in slow motion, if you will, slow enough motion that an academic journal, the American Journal of Sociology, published the anticipated demographic impact of the Indian partition before the partition happened. And you know how slow academic journals are with the review process and the publication, all that, to get it out. It wasn't something that happened one day and everybody woke up and said, oh my goodness, there's a partition in India. Okay? The events in Liberia, the events in Congo, the events in a whole manner of countries are not always quite as sudden as they appear. They're not quite as unpredictable as appear, and they're certainly not short-term, as these examples of emergencies lasting 60 years would suggest. Even the way we bring aid in humanitarian emergencies is shaped by this way of thinking. We assume that what's needed is medicine, maybe blankets to keep warm, very immediate short-term aid. But what often is required is schools for children, right? Safe delivery kits so that women can give birth who are pregnant, because they'll be pregnant for 4 months, 5 months now, much longer than just 2 weeks in which you see aid. And so we need to think about emergencies in a somewhat different way, in practical terms. Haiti's earthquake, for example. The fact that Port-au-Prince was built on a fault line had been known for a very long time, that its population had swelled because of the disastrous economy and a labor market that pulled people to the city, that the infrastructure was problematic. And in fact, there were forecasts of the earthquake in Haiti weeks in advance. All right? In general, there are predictions. In general, preparations are possible. Take what I said about Bangladesh and flooding. Current flooding in Bangladesh. It should not be a surprise that there's flooding in Bangladesh. Yet, is there an adequate stockpiling of supplies or preparations for what to do each time? No. Each time, there is an action after the flooding to try to respond. And this goes on a lot around the world. And we know that poverty greatly exacerbates suffering. What was the largest killer of children in Iraq during the whole time of the Iraq War? Right? It was versions of starvation. Some of them exacerbated by the war, many of them not. So humanitarian emergencies get seen in this framework. I'm not going to go through and read out everything that's on the board, but they get seen in a framework, they get constructed. And it's not just that you or I think in these terms, though I think most of us implicitly do. It's that there are agencies of the United Nations, there are charities like Oxfam, there are arms of the British government that are organized to think in these terms. These terms are translated into much more material structures of funding and of operations in all of this. Point 5, though, I'll come back to, right? The whole idea reflects a view from Durham, or at least from the places that understand themselves as not having an emergency. Oh, that's happening in Africa. That's happening in Asia. That's happening in Latin America. It's a view from relatively poor locations towards the periphery most of the time. I'm not sure how with lights. Can everybody see this okay? Yeah, okay. So the media are crucial. You've got a variety of photographs that are staples of journalism. You see a picture like this and you know the instant you see it that you're looking at a humanitarian emergency picture, right? That's in The Guardian. Oh, here's a story about. You don't know what country it is, but you know more or less the narrative. They're familiar. Natural disasters get mixed in the humanly created disasters. It all seems to be happening at once. When we see these pictures and we see television footage of these kinds of events, it's right now, it's simultaneous. That's happening somewhere in our lives, which is a very new way of thinking and being in the world. Very recent, right? It's all over in various settings. The images are amazingly interchangeable. These are from different continents, not just different places, right? The images represent strangers, right? They represent distant, anonymous people to a large extent. In a study that two of my students and I did of the photojournalism of humanitarian action, one of the things you find is there's almost never a flag or any national identifying symbol chosen. People have different costumes, different clothes. You know they're foreign in some sense. You might try to hazard a guess as to where these women are from, but in general, they're not identified by nation. They're often racially marked. They're visibly of other races, but not of particular countries, right? And they evoke sympathy, despite difference, and at a distance. The images are often of refugees. Refugees are the big face of humanitarian emergencies. People get displaced from their houses, they live in camps, and these become the most visible markers of emergencies. They're often seen in series. Lots and lots of the photographs are like these. They are of a whole series of people, a line, a queue at a feeding station, a queue at a roadblock, of a bunch of people who are marked off. This is suffering humanity, right? Humanitarians paradigmatically focus on strangers. That's the whole idea. It's humanity's suffering. It's not your brother's suffering, your sister's suffering. The whole idea is that you are sympathetic to strangers, that you're concerned with humanity as a whole. The idea reality is bound up in this. The International Committee of the Red Cross, for example, since its 19th century foundations, has always had this strong idea. In the case of a war, it doesn't ask which side are we with, right? It says, you're suffering, we want to help you, okay? That it will be impartial in whatever the conflict is. And this has been carried on in various ways as a part of the core understanding of people who work on humanitarian emergencies. Be neutral in various ways. Just bring help to anyone who. Very focus on suffering, right, is also significant. Suffering is common to humanity. We all suffer in various ways, greater or lesser. We can identify with that. It's not a focus on the things that are particular to different cultures, to different settings. And it's certainly not a focus on creating a new social order. As I will say more, it's in fact anti-political. It tries to stay away from politics. The idea of neutrality is already in a sense. It's not about rebuilding a political order and changing it. It's about bypassing politics to help fellow humans, in some sense. The human, it should be said, is not a self-evident category. Not everybody throughout human history has had a category of the human, of everybody in the world, especially not a category of everybody in the world understood in a kind of set logic, all those individuals who fit into the category human. That's not uniquely modern and Western, but very distinctively modern and Western as a understanding all of humanity, not through kinship, not through nation, not through other kinds of membership in a sense. Humanitarian agencies go out of their way to do this. When Islamic Relief was founded, for example, one of the first things that it did was to make clear that it did not help only Muslims, right? That it was about helping humanity. It was Muslims who ran it and paid for it who felt they should help humanity. And the same is true for Christian and other organizations that do this. The humanitarian idea is helping people outside. But it's also linked not just to universalistic ethical ideals, but to a kind of minimal notion, preventing unnecessary deaths, principally. Right? Reduction in excess mortality, as people say when they put together applications to DFID. Right? But that's a very minimal notion of life. It's not about human dignity. It's not about rebuilding the life you had before. It's about staying alive in the most minimal sense. It's the kind of that leads someone like Georgi Agamben to talk about an era of camps and the way in which camps define a sort of minimal sense of life. And that's a very modern idea, in a way. These images that I've been showing make distant suffering immediate. They make it now. They make it close to us in a way that wasn't the case before the very modern, very recent era. By itself, though, this doesn't make action seem compelling. It's nothing just about being simultaneous, since, as I've said, we often ignore people who are suffering 1 mile away. So there's no guarantee just the simultaneous character will do it. Part of what's going on is that we know, or at least believe, that there's a capacity to respond. We know that there are global markets. If we can sell things across the world, couldn't we give things away across the world? If we can wage war 10,000 miles away, couldn't we also deliver food 10,000 miles away? We understand that there's technology, that there's wealth, that there's organizations, that there's capacity, and we believe that we should do this. There's an ethics to it, or morality, and we even believe it's better, some of us believe at least, surveys suggest, better to help someone you don't know. To help someone you're close to is good. But to help somebody you don't have any relationship to is even better, more moral, more disinterested in some sense than helping the family member or the community member or the fellow national. Darfur has been a really prominent example in the last few years of an emergency. Right? People know the name Darfur who can't tell you what country it's in. They know it's an emergency. They know it's a disaster. They know terrible things are happening. They know there are bad people there. Right? It's decontextualized, right? But people feel they should do something. Right? The emergency and the humanitarian response are ways in which we take hold of the world. They're, as much as nations, things that we believe are out there in the world and real, but depend partly on how we think about things. The humanitarian idea, the idea of the compelling action, the response, specifically not politics, but also specifically not economics. We don't think of this as simply a source of entrepreneurial opportunities for profit makers. We think of it precisely as something you should do for different ethical reasons. It should be immediate and ethically pure. A survey about a decade ago in the Eurobarometer found that young Europeans asked, right, what is the most ethical thing you could do in your life, said, to be somebody who gives humanitarian action, who gives humanitarian aid. This was the most ethically pure thing that you could be. But humanitarian action, right, is more than that. What seems possible as well as ethical. And it's linked to an idea of progress. So now let me take you back a ways and look at the way in which the idea of humanitarian response is tied up, among other things, with the notion of progress, with the notion of order, with the notion of reform. The word humanitarian came into usage partly around reform movements. A good humanitarian was somebody who participated in movements intended to make things better: prisons, hospitals, poor relief, sorts of things, and colonialism. A lot of the humanitarianism of today has roots in colonial projects, trying to do something about famine in India, while Britain was the colonial power, for example, trying to produce development. The ills, this is my neighbor Jeremy Bentham, the ills that were attacked, right, the things challenged, say poor relief, almost always were managed. Almost all those reform movements failed to eliminate the thing in question. They managed it. Think of the building of mental hospitals. This did not in and of itself change the prevalence of mental illness. It might possibly have increased it by categorizing more people that way. What it did was manage where the mentally ill people were in the society. And there's a lot of this, a managerial orientation. I will suggest that despite the ethical foundation, a lot of modern humanitarian action has that managerial role. It is how rich countries manage the occurrence of disasters and problems in the world in various ways. Just as the British colonial rule managed Indian famines and epidemics and helped to create public health in the process. And indeed, social science came about this way. This is the first president of the American Sociological Association talking about how the importance of social science would be to reform humanitarian institutions because they were being run just on ethical grounds and not on modern scientific grounds. The idea of scientific philanthropy, that foundations should be created to channel the money of wealthy people, Andrew Carnegie, for example, the famous Scottish philanthropist, into scientifically proven ways of making life better. Some of this. The whole notion of development, which arose late in the colonial era as countries like Britain looked at their colonies and said, we need for them to be able to stand on their own feet when they're independent. We need a developmental project to get them ready for independence, whether it's Sudan or India or whatever. This gives way to a whole post-independence project of development that, particularly in the 50s and 60s, is an enormous project which lots of people believed in, right, and were often disappointed in by the 70s. And the idea of civil society, we thought as a voluntary sector, becomes in many ways the heir of a lot of the philanthropic impulse around this. Humanitarian aid, in this sense, often rationalizes. It builds these of layouts of tents. These are temporary housing for displaced people. And the first thing you should notice is that it doesn't look even remotely like a village. That everybody who's living in these tents has come from a village, none of which are laid out in rows of housing in that way. There's a process of rationalizing and managing. Displacement is disorder. We impose order, we bring it back, we create order, which is in some ways good and linked to giving people food and medicine, but also changes things, right? And becomes, in fact, a form of urbanization in a problematic way. The idea of humanitarian action flourished at a particular point. It came into being when people lost their faith in that idea of development, and often lost their faith in some big political projects. It came into its prime flourishing in its modern form in the 1970s. right? Really the late 60s or 70s. The Biafra crisis in Nigeria, Mozambican crisis in '73, a series of crises in this period set the template for modern humanitarian action. Among other things, there should always be a concert in which rock stars try to raise money for the people who are suffering, wherever it is. And that's often how some of us know about these events. The ethical ideal is related to human rights, which flourishes on the same time scale. The idea is not invented in the 1970s, but modern human rights action takes off in the same times. And I want to that loss of faith in development is hugely important. The idea of development was that you would make life better for everybody by a kind of economic progress, by growth. That was deeply damaged. It was damaged partly just by criticism of it and of the way in which development was organized, not least from the left, but also by the end of the big post-war boom that crashed in 1974-75, and economic crises that followed, the collapse of the Bretton Woods Accord, the collapse of a variety of post-colonial institutions, the Vietnam War, the Chilean coup. The 70s was an era in which lots of people's hopes were dashed for a transformative development project. And in the same sense, right, after 1968, there was a big turn against political solutions in many cases. Lots of large-scale political movements that had flourished in the 1960s, promising transformation, possibly revolution, right, began to look naive or began to produce disappointment. People began to think, well, you always lose the forces of order, the state wins, or began to believe that if you succeed, you end up with Stalinism, it's not very attractive, right? Médecins Sans Frontières, one of the most emblematic and iconic of modern humanitarian organizations, is born out of 1968. It's French Maoists who give up being Maoists, right, found this partly Catholic-inspired humanitarian organization to try to do good ethically, not politically, to do the things they could do to make life a little bit better. They specifically refuse any accounting in terms of progress. They are not trying to make society better directly. They're trying to help suffering people. And they refuse the idea of counting, right? Did you help 1 or 10 or 1,000? If you helped 1, that's good, right? And there's a whole ideology around this. And it's not just MSF, it's often religious, but it's not always. And it is the pursuit of an ethics among people for whom politics seems either impossible or essentially corrupt. If you go into politics, you will always be corrupted by power. You should try to be purely ethical. It's also reinforced by 1960s anti-authoritarianism. One of the interesting features of the last 30 or 40 years has been how widespread distrust in states have been. That both from the right, with various apostles of the market saying we should get rid of states because we should have private contracts all the time, but also on the left from a variety of post-1960s sort of anti-authoritarian, authority is bad advocates have also thought the state was bad. And there's been a lot of talk of the way states are problems and states are power. But think about the difference between when state is Britain or the United States, and state is Congo. Try to imagine what sort of peaceful solution, what sort of delivery of human services is possible in Congo without building a state to some extent. So the anti-statism in the global north gets translated into a particular idea of humanitarian action. It gets extended into humanitarians who believe the humanitarian agencies should run the camps and the organizations and the infrastructure to deliver aid, not the state. They shouldn't work with the state because states are bad. And so the whole humanitarian project is at odds with strengthening states in poor countries, countries prone to humanitarian emergencies. The idea of witness, very basic to Médecins Sans Frontières, right? Taken from a Catholic religious tradition. Because, being in solidarity with people, being a witness to their suffering, not necessarily being able to end it, not being able to prevent it next time necessarily, but bearing witness. There's an implicit sort of message. Everybody else ought to be paying attention, right? So it's not that bearing witness is without its link to a larger transformative agenda, but the direct agenda isn't political change, right? It's of solidarity and it's witness suffering, right? This is James Orbinski, the head of Médecins Sans Frontières in Canada after the Rwandan massacre. Moral campaigns have much of the same character. Right, so George Clooney or Mia Farrow, who get involved in campaigns on Darfur, right, are also interested in direct ethical action. They want to do something important, they want to do something good, they want to end suffering or at least reduce it, right? And they're not above calling on states or governments, get the United States to do something, push the Sudan around, but they want to bypass the Sudanese government, which they see as bad. It's a purely moral campaign, right? It's not left or right, whatever, right? Humanitarian action in this sense involves emergencies that are crises seen from the view of the cosmopolis, of the global centers. What looks like a crisis from here, from Britain, from the US, from continental Europe, as you look out at the world. And this is very important because it's all about sending people from first world countries to help people in third world countries. After any emergency, say the Sichuan earthquake in China, which is where the picture comes from, almost all of the life-saving humanitarian aid will be given by locals. In every single emergency of every kind that you can think of anywhere in the world, right, all of the aid will be given by locals or people who are already working there. And that's because who else is there fast enough? Right? Who else can do something the next day to help the person who is trapped under the fallen house? Okay? So the humanitarian project obscures the role of people like this woman, right, who just lived there, who is also helping a stranger, not necessarily someone in her family, but somebody in her town, and focuses on what is being done by the international agencies, the international actors, the directly moral action from abroad. Now, I'm going to sort of tell you a little bit about a brief genre of films that flourished for a few years that were sort of the humanitarian film narrative. There were several of these, and you'll recognize some of them. I won't go into each of them in detail, but Blood Diamonds was an example, Borders, and so forth. And there are certain stars. Angelina Jolie, throughout her career, has been distinctively identified with this, right? And a series of cognate messages. You should You should be active on behalf of people who are suffering. She's a spokesperson for the United Nations and so forth. But there are a variety of others. The humanitarian narrative took off not just because of all that photojournalism, but it got embedded in a narrative, a powerful narrative of what was going on in this Hollywood genre, which I think is probably finished. I think it had its moment, and part of the story that I'm telling you will be that humanitarian action of this kind flourished from the 70s until about now, and it's increasingly in trouble. This is a set of stories in which white guys save Africans. It's overwhelmingly Africans. Occasionally, it's Western Europeans save Yugoslavians, but it's mostly, right, whites save Africans in various ways. In these stories, there's an interesting twist. These are all ostensibly pacifist. They're all about the evils that come from war, and they almost all involve violent solutions to this. Violence is justified if you're fighting on the side of the good, we find out. So that the stories are sort of surprising in one sense as humanitarian stories. They almost all involve individual action. So they are part of a story of idealizing the individual, what you can do if you're doing good as an individual. They greatly exaggerate the possibility of what anyone can do as an individual in situations where the only effective responses are really socially organized responses. That's the narrative structure. Also involve men who start out as anti-heroes in the story, are saved and turned around by good women. So throughout the entire genre, right, there are these tough guys who are just out for themselves, and the reason they're in Africa is to make money. They're going to steal some diamonds, they're going to do something. But they meet a woman who softens them, teaches them some morality, right, reorients them, and then they use their toughness to fight for the little guy and produce at least some level of correction to the situation. Only one of the entire genre, there are a whole series of these, of which 14 major box office movies in this time period, right? The only really not macho film is the iconic film of action not. The whole story of Hotel Rwanda is that the UN does not defend the little guy in this case, or the victim and the suffering. It's also the only film in the whole genre which has a non-white protagonist, the only one. Right? Now, in fact, humanitarian action is not mostly like those movies. It's mostly about logistics. You want to get food to people who are starving? It's actually a big logistical operation to ship food around the world. You want to get medicines, which sometimes need to be refrigerated, to people in the Congo, right? This is no small task logistically. Dubai Aid City, linked to being constructed out of the humanitarian trade fair, a little bit on hold because of the economic crisis, though I understand it's still to be built. Corporations like Global Supply Systems, which works almost entirely in this field, right? It's not just adventure. Now, is humanitarianism then a nice face of a lingering imperialism? Who are these white guys, in this case in Liberia, right? Now, I don't think that's the whole story, right? It's a way people find to try to do good and make the world better and reduce suffering, but it's a way of doing that when economic development and political change seem impossible, unlikely, or corrupting. It's an alternative in a way. So it isn't that it's bad necessarily, but it does have blind spots about the way in which it's entangled in some of the organizations of the world of inequality and so forth. It is all about the first world ministering to the third. It's organized in managerial ways, but with a very moral message. The world gets divided into actors and acted upon. There are the countries that do things and the countries that have things done for their people or to them in various ways. This comes out of the colonial moment, right? It continues in the era of very unequal development, and it's reinforced in a variety of humanitarian organizations. But what's the story today when Europe is in crisis, when the economies of Europe lead governments to impose austerity programs on their own citizens, whether or not they do on their foreign aid programs, when there's dramatic growth in China or Brazil or India? Are we, for this reason partly, coming to the end of a cycle? Was this something that happened at the very tail end of a long boom of Western dominance as an attempt to make something more moral out of what had often been a bloody, war-laden, conflict-ridden era, an era of problematic, deep inequality? Was this the effort, sort of at the tail end of that era, to moralize it? One of the basic meanings of a humanitarian emergency is that action should be taken. I said that at the beginning. It feels compelling. Somebody's suffering over there. We should do something. We would in this room. If somebody collapsed in the back of the room, we'd try to help them. This is the long-distance version of that. It's compelling. But, right, this also essentially means calling anything a humanitarian emergency authorizes outsiders to act. It is an authorization that people, not the government of that country, can act, and they can often bypass the government of that country to do it. And I'm not suggesting this is wrong. I'm suggesting this is really complicated and fraught, and we tend to not think through all the complications very well. We tend to say sovereign state power are bad. We should go directly to the suffering people, but this may undercut any building of the institutions, which in the long run could more continuously provide support. It's not easy to figure out what to do, right? And the outsiders who act legitimate their action by the suffering of the insiders, exactly as, say, the British Empire legitimated its colonial action by pointing to a practice like sati in the famous Edmund Burke essay, something like that. In India, women are suffering because of the horrible abuse of men. Therefore, we need to conquer the country and establish colonial rule and do things, right? Now, it's an open debate what colonial rule does, whether it's justified or not, but what it isn't is spreading democracy, even if the long-term result might be that there are democratic countries. It is still an empowerment of some people to make choices for others. Now, one reason I think that is increasingly difficult is that the outsiders who are empowered to act today are larger and larger terms, the military. 20 years ago, if you talked about humanitarian action, You were talking about doctors who decided that instead of practicing medicine in Durham, they were going to join Médecins Sans Frontières and go to Africa. They were going to do that during their summer breaks or when it was needed. You were talking about college students who are saying, when I graduate, I want to do something I really feel good about. I'm going to join Oxfam. I'm going to join an organization that does that. That's still going on. But in almost every place where there's a humanitarian emergency today, there is a security challenge. And it is very difficult for the humanitarians to work without working alongside and in cooperation with the military. And the humanitarians are often killed. The Red Cross workers are killed alongside the military because in, say, Afghanistan, they still look like outsiders. They may not be Americans, they may not be part of the military, they may not be British or the NATO force, but the repeated bombings of the Red Cross, the blowing up targets of ambulances and so forth, suggest the old idea of neutral assistance, that if you were showing the Red Cross we could trust you to be neutral, is breaking down. And there's a sort of circular process in which even the people who still believe in the neutrality feel they have to have military protection, they have to work with militaries. Moreover, militaries are actually really good at logistics. Do you want to ask who's really good at logistics, at food to far corners of the world? The answer is not humanitarian organizations, which are pretty good. The answer is large-scale corporate capitalism, which is great at shipping stuff all over, and militaries. Militaries have fantastic logistics. So if you want to get aid anywhere, and if that's your only goal, and you don't have any other ethical issue about it, it's a good bet to go with the military. They have airplanes, they have cargo planes. They can just as easily take a container load of food as a tank. Okay? And militaries play a bigger and bigger role. Governments, which provide a large part of the humanitarian support, increasingly contract with militaries to do this. The US government actually contracts with Walmart to distribute humanitarian assistance as well. Okay? So that we deliver help by means of large-scale corporations and the military, and that changes the humanitarian enterprise. It makes it harder to be that person who thinks, I'm just trying to do good as an individual, because there are all these people in uniforms with guns also trying to do good. Actually, I think the military, by and large, is trying to be ethical. Militaries, in fact, are often changing their understanding of their mission. They're saying, we're never going to conquer anyone ever again, but we're going to have to be police in places like Afghanistan or Iraq, so that other people can help in various ways and do education or healthcare or whatever. But it changes that humanitarian moment. Ideal of neutrality came with a sort of zone of safety. The idea that if the locals knew you were just trying to help, you were safe. Right? It's very hard to maintain that. The idea of humanitarianism became a field. It had boundaries and a distinctive sense of value. It was about being ethically good, and it was different from economic activity, different from the pursuit of political power, even for good ends. But increasingly, it gets up with it. It has trouble maintaining the boundaries with these other kinds of activities in various ways. And people start asking, how does this fit into change? And they ask even, not here alone, the people in the various countries start asking, how does this fit into any agenda for long-term change in our country? How do we, the citizens of Mali or Congo or Sudan or wherever, take hold of this and take hold of this ourselves, not just as recipients of aid from outside? So we wonder, at least I wonder, is an era ending? Is there some way of being in the world that was importantly about ethics versus politics and economics for 35 or 40 years that is harder to maintain as a notion of a pure alternative today? And where does this leave those people in the countries facing humanitarian emergencies? Do they come out of this as the suffering masses and objects of charity, or do they come out of this as people who can have voice, who can shape their lives? A question Hannah Arendt made famous speaking of refugees in the wake of World War II and Nazism, right? Are these people who are stripped of the rest of their humanity, living a minimal existence, where what the world does is simply offer them the chance to stay alive? Or are they people with specific political values, desires, language, and voice, seeking to choose a way to live, not only to stay alive? And that, I think, is where we are in the world today.
Having chaired many lectures, often when I don't know what to say, I say that was a tour de force. It's actually a cover. It means it was, wonderful overview, but I don't quite know how to relate to it. But I think this is different, and this was different. It was both incredibly interesting and also very engaging. And I certainly have questions, and we have a roaming mic somewhere. So should we start with questions from the floor? Lots, good. How do you want to take them, one at a time or one at a time? Okay.
So thank you very much for an extraordinarily enlightening evening. But I just want to comment a little bit on the politics side of things. My name's Maitland Hislop. I'm from Northumbria University. I also run a company during the day. But if you look at the North Kenya Somali border, Oxfam have been operating there for 50 years. There's been a humanitarian response on a huge scale. The British government have educated people. But if you go there today, the question they will say is, what good has this done us? And actually, it's done untold harm. It's broken down social structures. It's removed the political structure. It's removed what was a strong Islamic community and replaced it with a vacuum where Islamic values no longer pertained. That has meant Al-Qaeda has been able in latter stages to come in and replace those values, often with money. And it's meant that Oxfam has been displaced by Korea, who has a very sustainable development agenda as opposed to a humanitarian agenda. So I was just wondering in that context how you'd place the political agenda and whether you see that as a decline of your humanitarian view and a replacement with a second world development agenda.
I think you've eloquently laid out problems with a particular example in mind. And so let me say two things, sort of moving backward through it. Is this development agenda second world? The only part of that I would even have a question about, since I agree with the rest of it, is how to classify what kind of development agenda potentially moves in, and whether it is an alternative, it is a second world, is that an echo of a previous socialist communist? Well, not really, that's not what's going on in that area. What is what passes for Islamist, but is exactly a certain kind of extremism which uses Wahhabi ideology and money, as you said, but is not, in fact, Islamic community in a serious way. What that development agenda is, what Korea, is Korea the second world in this? So I have a question about that phrase. Everything else that you said, I think, is exactly right. It's not the whole story. So I want to say that is the story I've been telling, and I pretty much agree. I also think the people who've been working there are often ethical, good people. They've made personal sacrifices. They've, some of them lost their lives, and they've worked hard over long periods of time. And I think that the organizations like Oxfam that work very long-term in places, generally speaking, do better. That much more harm is done by those that parachute in immediately after emergencies and try to work for 6 months in a country they don't know. And that those that build routes are better. So Partners in Health among smaller organizations, Paul Farmer's group, but Oxfam, some do better in general. But that said, your account is close to my story because it looks at the collateral, if you will, social, institutional damage done by something that one life at a time is helping people, while collectively undercutting the whole capacity to keep sustaining life. So on the political side, there is a question of what kind of politics, and the dangers of various forms of what gets called today extremism, for want of a better word, but the dangers of vacuum-filling political group, which can easily shade over into warlords and gangs, essentially. And that's something we have a lot of that. You should be worried about this in the world. There's a lot of potential for this in the world. Are there also projects of a better politics? Not very much in the case that you cite, from what I know of it. In some other cases, more and better. There are places where there are more cultural and institutional resources still to draw on for people. One reason why I wrote the book Nations Matter a few years ago, which was completely out of sync with thinking at the moment when it was written and published in a way, is that for many of the places in the world, national politics is actually much more likely to deliver something viable for a development and a politics from that place rather than imposed. And by being against all states and all nations and thinking we should get rid of all of that, we don't wind up having lovely communities and global cosmopolitanism. We often wind up having Al-Qaeda and a variety of warlords instead of states. To me, stateless place, well, what are we looking at? Central Asia? This doesn't look so good in the Caucasus. I mean, it's Congo. I'm not, I think there are a lot of problems with thinking that way. That there's huge evil done by states, but statelessness isn't the solution. It's politics. I think what Korea is doing there is economics, not politics. And so I don't think there's really a political project so much as there's an economic project. It has political dimensions, but China in Africa, Korea in Africa, and for that matter, most of the Persian Gulf in Africa are there with economic projects, sometimes with some other political or ideological component. But for example, food, right? The buying up of huge amounts of African land for farming, for the Persian Gulf, for Asia. So I think that that's the worry. So the best I can do. Yeah. You got a hand up before. I passed. Okay, same question. I can give away this microphone, but I won't have one. This is the big paradox of aid.
Thank you. I'm very interested in China and Chinese development. The People's Republic claims that they've, with the economic development in the last, say, 25, 30 years, that 700-800 million people have left poverty and are on their way to much greater economic, social security, etc. You also mentioned China in Africa in terms of development. I'd be very interested to hear your impressions about perhaps the Chinese century.
I'd be happy to. I'll try to be short, though. It's a subject I could go on a lot about. So what about China? By China's official measures, 7 or 8 million people have been lifted out of poverty. I think, I don't know if it's 7 or 8 million. It's very hard to second guess the statistics there, but it's a lot. And it really has happened. Lots of people have, in fact, begun to live above poverty indicators. Now, to some extent, they live in soulless cities and in difficult situations, and this has come at costs to families and, linking it to the previous question, to social institutions. That is, some of that very development has also been undermining of some of the kinds of social institutions that work for. But it's good to be out of poverty. Really think we have a basis for doubting the broad outline of the. What we then have to notice is this was not done by remotely democratic means. This was voluntary to some extent, in that starving as peasants in the Northwest might migrate voluntarily to the Southeast and take jobs, but it wasn't a collective democratic project. It was a very state-centered project, although the state ceded some of where it probably knew that it couldn't do things itself, to joint ventures and to other businesses and to other ways. And we could look at Korea in Africa, but Korea in Korea, and see a statist model of development. So I think one of the things we have to look at in the world, not particularly about humanitarianism, is that successful development models are not always as integrated with liberal democracy as the story of some capitalist development in the West was for various reasons. And whether that couplet of liberal democracy and capitalism are going to stay together is a big global question posed notably there. There are other examples. Brazil looks a lot more attractive and promising. Its growth has stalled at the moment, but you're getting a lot more building of new institutions and work to try to be inclusive of populations there. They're getting some in China. The hottest thing in China right now, I was just in China a few weeks ago, is recognition that there's going to be a very large aged population, increasingly separate from their children and needing some kind of institutionalized care, and that the breakdown of the old Danwei system is, means that they won't get it through the old state models. So there could be a new, the way I sum up then to make the long story short is the way of getting growth that is there is one that has undermined institutions that can sustain social stability. And the big question is how much they will be built. I think we saw that right here in the 19th century. That is, we saw a rapacious kind of capitalist growth that undermined traditional communities, which were not always just wonderful. They were often paternalistic and dominated by the Prince Bishops of Durham, dominated by various people who were not just in it to be democratic or something. But there was some reciprocity, there was some stability, and there was eventually some level of building of new institutions. And we can say the glass is half full or half empty, but Britain builds a whole range of new institutions and eventually a welfare state to try to mitigate some of these disruptive, deinstitutionalizing features of economic development. That's a relatively good story, not completely, but relatively good story. And I think the question in China and in other rapidly developing countries now is, will the same thing happen? Will that compensatory movement of building institutions come? It came here with lots of political struggle. And it came here with the example of France next door, and people start saying, oh, well, they chopped off the head of the king. We didn't do anything there. Maybe we should do something for the poor here. And so it was a very particular history that produced the stronger institutions that were built. And so I think the link between the stories is we have different things going on that in various ways undercut the institutional order in which people live, and a big question about how to rebuild it, especially if there's no political movement to rebuild it. So the Brazil case, it's a case of politics. It's a case of well-organized political movements demanding land rights and redistribution, demanding the creation of new institutions in the country to a very considerable extent. So I think we should be somewhat cautiously hopeful that there are possibilities for good politics as well as bad, including in China, including in Korea, including other places. Korea is actually interesting at this level now. It is getting better.
Just do a switch.
Switch?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Zoe Cormack. I'm a PhD candidate in history, and I wanted to ask you about what your thoughts are on this celebrity involvement in humanitarianism. Do you think this is a positive thing, or can it be actually quite damaging? And I'm thinking particularly about George Clooney's involvement in the Satellite Sentinel project in Sudan. And also, would you say that this is the end of your old era of humanitarianism, or is this kind of part of a new era where celebrities are actually kind of getting involved in research and documentation of humanitarian crises?
Okay, really good question about the role of celebrities in all of this. As a teacher, I can't help, shameless plug for my student Lisa Ritchie and her book on Project Red and her book on celebrity activism. But the issue of celebrities is interesting. This has become one of the things you do if you're a celebrity. You do concerts if you're a rock star, you do being a special representative of the United Nations, you do activism of various kinds. In many cases, it's just appearance as a celebrity to lend help and publicity to events, raising money. Right? In a few cases, like someone like George Clooney, it is a much more sustained activism, and when you look at that. So I think that partly this is a story just about a celebrity society and the way in which we depend on celebrities for lots of things and the media system that produces that. It's also, though, a version of this story about people who want to do good. George Clooney, I think, is somebody who genuinely feels lucky, privileged, wants to do good. Right? So I'm going to say that that's not an ethical failing. This whole story, I'm going to say there's something wrong with it, but it's not that. I think he is genuinely being ethical and trying to do good in this. I think, however, that lots of the work in Sudan is fundamentally misguided. So I won't try to go back and show different slides to show that. If I put up pictures of the so-called guerrilla fighters of the justice and equality movement and the government soldiers, you could not tell me. I will bet money you couldn't tell me which is which if we put it to audience votes. You couldn't tell on the claim that it's a racial distinction, that one group are black Africans and the other are Arabs. You couldn't tell in their clothes, you couldn't tell in the trucks. They have the exact same Japanese trucks, the guns, the whole thing. They are symptoms of a larger thing. So the idea that there's simply bad guys with one side, good guys with the other, just won't wash. Religiously, there are complicated differences. Hassan Tarabi and his movement of a particular kind of Islamic power movement in the region is a part of this story, but so is the fact that Darfur is an ancient district with long ties to Libya, an empire in its own right, and a kingdom before the independence of Sudan, that there are sort of regional politics in which the Sudanese ruling families all come from the Nile Basin and sort of gross the resources. It's a big, complicated story. The specifics of that hinge on a prior involvement with southern Sudan, and then extending the logic that what's going on in Darfur must be like what's going on in southern Sudan, where there are different religious issues. There are issues of Christians and animists and persecution. There is an issue of kidnapping into slavery. There are certain things that are not core to Darfur in the same way. And there are other things going on. Behind the Darfur conflict is a water rights conflict. The drying up, it's global warming that is producing the Darfur conflict in significant part, with a disappearance of wells, a disappearance of the ability to water and keep animals as a result of this for herding people. There's forced sedentarization of herding people, and then a fight over the land which is newly scarce where they are. So there are all these other things. So that's all relevant to George Clooney in that the kind of celebrity activism basically erases all of this. It does sometimes include research in new kinds of collection, like the Sentinel satellite survey, that is, get a satellite that's going to watch movements of people and watch, which was largely set up in that particular case when it was feared that there would be massive violence connected to the separation of the North and the South in Sudan. There was suffering, but not huge violence at that moment. The violence had come before. But I think it's sort of a misconception and an erasure of lots of other things locally. It's also an organization. Behind George Clooney is John Prendergast, a particular politically active former academic African specialist of sorts, who is an advocate and who is steering with others a campaign, mostly funded by right-wing Christians and the sort of pro-capitalist Christian right in the US, and the Koch brothers and so forth. And so it's got a complicated politics behind it. And it looks so easily, what celebrity politics does is make it look like this handsome guy who seems to be genuinely ethical, telling you that they're horrible people doing things to these other innocent people. And the larger story gets lost. The campaign is heavily focused on using publicity from the Sudan to sway people in the US Congress to use military force in the Sudan. My own view is military force from the United States hasn't solved very many global problems recently, and probably would not solve any in the Sudan. So that there is a serious political problem to what this ethically good man is doing. And part of what I'm trying to say is that the confusing ethics and politics can really undermine our ability to produce the analyses we need of what's going on in many cases.
Hi, my name's Tom Foley. I'm an ex-Durham student, and I'm now a doctor in Newcastle. You gave a very thought-provoking description of where humanitarianism has come from and where we are now, but I was wondering what advice you have for the existing, maybe the legacy of Western aid organizations and even Western governments going forward in the new world.
Yeah, so good question, and it's the right question to ask me, because my point here is not to say, oh, well, this is all terrible, we should never do any of it. So I personally give money to a couple of organizations, and I would use criteria that I stated before, organizations that work relatively long-term in places that develop opportunities for indigenous workers that are not only about bringing people in from the global north, but are about training, education, helping people become healthcare workers elsewhere, like Partners in Health in Haiti, and so forth. So I think you can discriminate among the organizations, and the data is pretty readily available, though giving is dominated by publicity campaigns and marketing and not by people looking at these underlying characteristics. I think that what needs to happen for people who would work in it is to be more and more attentive, and many are more and more attentive to these larger contextual factors. And it's a field full of self-critique and frustration at the moment. And I should come clean and say that my wife, who was a former director of emergency response for the United Nations and is currently the head of the office in Khartoum and is in the Sudan and is in Darfur at the moment, right? So I live in close proximity to this, that there are ways of being better and worse in doing this, and they fall partly on the same lines. Are you doing this in ways that essentially substitute for and undermine the institutions that would be required to be able to have a viable social life and some political voice wherever you are? Or are you doing it in ways that encourage and help in that? And it's a tough call because often you won't know. And your motivation is to help people. And the ethical good remains. If there's somebody suffering and you helped them, that's good. I think that is ethically good. But it's not the only good. It's not the definition of the good. It is a kind of good. And it's limited in these ways when you get tied up with large-scale interventions. So as in my George Clooney story, which I could elaborate at length, the advice I would give is be thoughtful. Approach this with some sort of social scientist's effort to look at the intersection of the different factors that bear on it. Social science really is useful for these kinds of things, although there isn't a huge volume of social science of humanitarianism. Think about this question of where the ethics stands in relation to markets and politics. And don't just imagine it's a trump card against markets and politics, because some kinds of things happen in the world through markets and politics, and there are good reasons for that. Or even if there are no good reasons, markets and politics are really powerful, and you can't just play the ethical trump card all the time. And above all, be very careful about substitutionist thinking, in which, I guess I'm sort of repeating myself, in which you imagine that your organization, because it is dedicated to the good, can be a replacement for local structures wherever you work. I think that's the fatal hubris of many in the humanitarian community, not all. And it comes partly from working in extremely chaotic situations where lots has gone wrong, where the government has been bad. If you worked in Liberia after Charles Taylor's rule, you're not going to think that government is good for much. It's, terribly bad in some ways. But also, after the end of his rule, there wasn't any. It really was a very anarchic setting with lots of small groups fighting with each other in sort of crazy situation. And so anyone who wanted to be helpful there had to sort of build their own new organization. But that kind of experience encourages a way of thinking that is, I think, overall and long-term pernicious. This idea of substituting your good organization imported from the UN or wherever for anything that can be built there and integrated with the voice of local people. So that would be the best advice I could offer.
Right, it's just me in front, yeah. Thanks. I'd like to press you a little bit on voice as well, because it seems to me that there are two pathways at the moment, or at least, I mean, more than that probably, but one is possibly leading back to medieval and Renaissance times, where you have a version of voice, which is personal responsibility and obligation to what befalls you. So we could, I kind of sometimes find some of the debates on empowerment could lead people into this, to thinking they are entirely responsible for all goods and bads, and that is this kind of really, this pressure to be empowered and have voice can be, I think, quite detrimental as well. So the other, possibly better pathway seems to be a sort of renegotiating where obligation, responsibility, even blame has to be apportioned. Do you see that happening, or are we going back into medieval times, as it were, moving forward?
Subtle question and complicated. I'm not sure everybody could hear it all, so let me try to summarize. So is voice the only way to think about better things being built? And are there some catches to thinking in terms of voice and the obligatory idea, and I think here the image that everyone as an individual should be speaking up in some empowered fashion and crafting the circumstances of their lives, which may be, if nothing else, unrealistic in lots of settings. And there's a heritage. I'm sympathetic to that view. I think that we never should opt for something that voluntarily says less voice per se, that I'm still democratic enough to want to say that. But we shouldn't imagine that voice alone is going to be the solution, and certainly not voice understood individualistically or understood as saying new things. So when you talk about a community being able to live the way it wants to live, you're not talking necessarily just about individual voices and so forth. And you may be talking about a web of obligations and communal solidarities that work in a less articulate way. And this is a hard line. So I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we should be talking about obligations. We should be talking about solidarities and the ways in which people work together in their lives, and that sometimes hyper-individualistic calls for voice are at odds with that. So that part I want to agree with completely. I think we also, the image of negotiating is a little bit of a trip. I mean, how do we get those better solidarities? And how do we arrive at ideas of limits? I think that there are important renegotiations going on in many of these settings of limits, of things that are off limits in many cases, so that there are thinking about human rights that works on gendered terrain and changes not so much, if you will, the ideal and doesn't create the utopia, but it creates new limits against some kinds of bad things. And there are sort of local Geneva conventions, if you will, that get created in various settings about what people won't do and won't let others do in the wake of these conflicts. And I think there's a lot of chance to build on that as people think, we're not going to go back to that state. We don't want to be back where we were in Charles Taylor's time in Liberia. And sort of tacit agreements get worked out among people that offer some chance to move forward. So I think you're right that my term voice is a not very good description for that process entirely, that it sounds too much like a liberal democratic or like the Renaissance image of complete responsibility, which was of course only for elites. But yeah, I mean, I think that's true, and I don't actually claim to have an answer for all of the ways in which we would do this. But I would put that there are three things. There's sort of solidarities that are good, but that turn out to always come with inequality and, you know, different kinds of bads. So good, thriving community, but patriarchal and gender biased or whatever. There are more liberal notions of individual freedoms, which I think we should endorse, but not imagine are perfect and trump cards against that. And very importantly, there are limits. There are tacit collective understandings of lines that shouldn't be crossed. And those are very important, and they're one of the big things that gets lost when we lose the structures of local and sometimes national and other culture. We lose some of the historical accomplishments. A lot of those historical accomplishments are embedded in those notions of what won't happen, not just in our aspirations for what should happen.
I'm interested in the reasons you give for seeing humanitarianism as a feature of the West in decline. You know, in other words, the exact sort of arguments that underpin that conception. Related to that, I wonder whether you think the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, all wars of choice, are just an extreme version of what you're talking about. That is to say, a crazy extreme version of humanitarian intervention that comes in, lops off heads, and disappears again. So, in a sense, it's without all pretense in many ways. It's conducted under the mantle of realpolitik. It's a military intervention to remove dictatorship, but it's not nation building, it's not listening to voice, it's not explicating and empowering locals. On the contrary, it's often leaving a political vacuum in which violence then breeds, and so on. So let's...
So to the second part of that, a simple yes. I do think that most wars of choice in that sense, no matter how noble their stated objectives, end up being problems in the way that you described. So I won't try to repeat that. I'll go to the first question. I mean, with only the note that I didn't say all, I said most. I can't imagine circumstances in which militaries can play a different role and so forth. But one of the conditions of playing that different role would be that it's very unusual, and that would be seen as very unusual and different. The fact that there has been as much of this kind of long-distance intervention, the whole Cold War version of it, and then after that, more recently, undermines the prospects for any version of this turning out to be good, even if it intends to be good. I think is just tarred with that. The first question about reasons why I think this is Western is a long one, a part of it. I think that it's linked to the idea of a pure individual ethical action, which isn't uniquely Kantian or something, but is widely Western and not widespread elsewhere. The notion that individuals should find an ethical orientation to the world that is their own and embedded in individual action. So part of what I tried to evoke with my analysis of the film, the paper that's based on it, is the interesting feature of the individual protagonist, which is partly just filmmaking. It's really hard to make films with no individual protagonists and have Hollywood blockbusters, but it also has this distorting effect that I think is widespread. I think that this is about ideas that are hinged on individualism in the way in which that is distinctively Western. Now again, not uniquely Western, and not that people aren't individuals elsewhere, not that it hasn't spread, and not that nobody ever gives a donation from Hong Kong to try to help people who are suffering after an earthquake somewhere either, but that this has been, in fact, Japan is a very significant humanitarian funder now, but it's not a significant source of this kind of individual expressive humanitarianism. It is a government funder of large scale of the United Nations, actually one of the United Nations' largest humanitarian funders. But there's a difference between that sort of national institutional response through the United Nations to earthquakes or whatever, and the way in which the voluntaristic individual ethical, the seeking of the non-political ethical orientation, which I think is distinctly Western. I think there are other things. I think that it has grown up in the context of a hierarchically organized Western-dominated globalization. And so it's about mitigating some of what goes on in the world in the context. It is about a sense of responsibility that people who are relatively privileged and empowered feel in a world that is hierarchically organized and full of problems. It's not just anybody from anywhere, it is people from the global core, to a large extent, feeling this. And I think third, that the sense of a capacity to act is linked up to this, and it has a history of the growth of organizations. So, back to Dunant and the Red Cross and so forth.
I agree with you only to a point. I mean, I have a great deal of intellectual sympathy for the argument and a great deal of intellectual sympathy to what you think is the alternative. But the alternative, as you explicated, could look rather weak. Take the alternative view, the Chinese view, that isn't based on a strong concept of individualism, is based on a strong concept of development. You want to engage, as China does in parts of Africa. For them, the issue is not framed, or if at all ever framed in terms of humanitarian intervention. It's framed in terms of development agenda, strengthening the development of an agenda of a country. So of course it comes with a prior claim, we want your copper, but we want your copper and you want schools or you want hospitals, that's fine, we'll just come in and build them. Yeah, whatever it is, we'll just come in and build it. It's your agenda, you tell us your priorities, and all the niceties and complexities of your alternative get, of course, lost in that, but it provides a very direct alternative, non-individualistic form of response.
Sure. Go to a moment of not what I think should happen, because I'm not mainly that, and I'm actually in certain ways unsure, save for the fact that I think it needs to include a politics, and the politics needs to be sensitive to the economy and the political development, and that's part of what's caused this. But I think there are several alternatives out there. If you told me just in a disinterested way to bet my retirement savings on one of them, I'd bet on the Chinese version, not on what you call my alternative. That is, I would say the most likely way of organizing activity is going to be statist capitalism. That is, China's more capitalist than communist, but it's not liberal capitalist, it's a kind of statist capitalism. That's likely to be the most powerful force that emerges. So that's one, right? And not just China itself, but others playing roughly that game. Two, I think there's a very big chance for more conflict, more geopolitical conflict and large-scale conflict in the world, and that reinforces the extent to which the statist solutions are also partially military, as they are in China. So China's overt pitch in Africa is exactly as you say, we will do a simple transaction. Yeah. We want your minerals or your farmland or whatever it is, and you want something we can give you, roads, prisons, whatever. And that gets away from the moralism of the West and the strings attached to aid and the conditionalities. And so it's very attractive in Africa and in other parts of the world. And I don't think it's ipso facto morally wrong for China to do that. I do think that China's understanding of China, though, is not just development, it's national interest. And that this is really driven by a very strong Chinese nationalist understanding of national interest and what we're trying to get out of China. I think that what I would like is a relatively unlikely but more attractive project of building institutions and more benign states in the world. And I wouldn't bet my retirement savings on it.
Well put. It's getting late, but there's so many people who want to ask you a question. So what I suggest is, I give Patrick the mic, and you go around the room and just collect several questions, and you have a final response to all of them. Okay. So I don't want people to go away and not having
I'll try to keep the response short. That'll be harder.
Hi there. What you were saying about how the media portrays humanitarian crises and the way in which they kind of paint pictures of masses of people as opposed to individuals, all those things. I was just wondering how you think the media should instead be portraying these kind of emergencies, like what the media should be doing differently to stop these narratives of like emergency responses that you were talking about.
I was really fascinated by what you were saying about humanitarianism and as a kind of symptom of disillusionment with political processes, with progress narrative, and of the tendency to try and bypass political systems. But on the counter to that, I'm interested by a tendency amongst NGOs or aid agencies to be involved in what can hardly be described as non-political campaigning, whether it be drop the debt or fair trade or enough food if. And I'm wondering whether you see that as a kind of the NGOs growing up and realising they have to work with political institutions, or whether it's more of the same global core trying to tell the rest of the world what would be a political good outcome.
I think Duffield, in the way he linked development to security, how do we situate humanitarian new post 9/11 global context? Should I just shout? He made quite a strong link between development and security. How should we situate humanitarian aid within the post 9/11?
More questions? More questions? Yeah, I think there's one more. There's one more.
Yeah, I'm interested in your discussion about sort of ideology of humanitarianism, and I wondered how what your thoughts were on this on the Syrian conflict at the moment, where humanitarian seems to be interpreted in terms of weapons.
Great, thank you. Any others? All right, let me try to go in order. The media, and what could they do differently? What do they say? How do they understand it? What sort of prospect is there? Of course, it turns out the media is lots of different things, and I talked about two, a sort of photojournalism and Hollywood films, but there are lots and lots of other media, including alternative media. There's a growing web-based and social media world of alerts, of early warnings of potential actions, including genocidal actions or famines or other sorts of things. So there are versions of media that are playing very different roles in this. Photojournalists whom I've interviewed are at once sort of excited by getting their photos published and all of this, and frustrated. And what they say is, editors pick photos like you say. So what they say to my students, and I have studied the photojournalist part, is this is editors. This is not us, the photographers. This is the editors who want those pictures. We give them 20 rolls of film, or that was back in the days of film, but we give them all manner of photographs, and they systematically pick women and children, not men. If they pick men, it's men with guns, and women and children trying to get food or something like that, and a whole series of attributes. So they say it's the editors. There's another bit of media that is important, which is the media run by the humanitarian organizations linked to their fundraising. And interestingly, they do pretty much the same thing. So the fundraising arm of most of the major humanitarian organizations that do private donations sends out lots of advertising. It used to be direct mail, it's increasingly online, uses a lot of visuals. This is my first claim, that it's just very visual. It's almost unimaginable without the immediacy of the visual appeal. And the same thing is done. The portrayals are, I actually don't remember the percentage at the moment, vast majority women and children. Suffering is shown in women and children. It happens men suffer in humanitarian emergencies too. It is somewhat sexually biased, as women in certain ways suffer more, partly because the men are more likely to get shot, but also because of patriarchal distribution of food and things. But there's an interesting sort of structure there, and it's done by the humanitarian agencies themselves in many ways, as they represent this, and they will give the answer, but that's what works. We are just marketers. The people who do marketing in organizations like MSF have almost never been out in the field. So the people that we interviewed who put out the newsletters and the campaigns have almost never been to the countries those are about, or worked in the field operations of those agencies. All the agencies tend to have a division between people who do field work, who are these highly motivated by ethical concerns, want to make sacrifices and do something personally, and headquarters people in various ways. And the people in the field all complain about the headquarters people and so forth. So there's an organization there. What do I think the media could do in some way differently? I think they could report on these events and circumstances differently, including in a way that wasn't always a surprising thing happened yesterday in Africa, but was sometimes about longer-term conditions and things going on. Now, I recognize that to them doesn't, as they put it, sell papers. Nothing sells papers anymore. But the issue is the sort of sensationalism and the attraction of the event that seemed to come out of the blue and hit people who had no complicity in it in any way. And they reproduce that in ways I think they could change. I think there could be, though I don't, again, I'm not going to bet my retirement savings on it, there could be more journalism in serious outlets that actually reports on underlying conditions, on longer term events, that does analysis and so forth. But people have been calling for that, wishing for it, during a whole era when the print media have been laying off the kind of reporters who do that work because it doesn't sell papers or something. So that we'd have to get into a different analysis of the whole media field to get at it. I'm much more optimistic that the semi-voluntary web-based and social media networks will produce a different kind of reporting in their world than that the mainstream press, including the BBC and everybody like that, will do something deeply different. BBC does better than average in that world, but it's still pretty much caught by this other way. And there's a lot of other kinds of reporting and discussion out there. It's just reaching 2,000 people at a time instead of 2 million. The NGOs, indeed, good point. So NGOs get involved in campaigning that looks a lot like politics, even though they may say it's not politics, and they may specifically try to target it outside politics. I think that's true, and a weak point in my presentation, or something I haven't even figured out in writing on how to say, is I think that it's not that nobody does politics, it's that even politics is done with this anti-politics orientation. So, for a moment, never mind humanitarianism, think of all the political parties in the world, like Beppe Grillo and the Five Star Movement in Italy, who say, we're against all politics, vote for us. Right? I mean, that is the largest political movements in Europe during the crisis are anti-political movements. They're sort of plague on both their houses, vote for us, we'll just make fun of them, we don't have a governmental solution, at least we don't lie to you and tell you we have a governmental solution. And by the way, we hate foreigners. So there are lots of forms of anti-politics. This is one where people run campaigns that are both economic and political often, like some of the attempts to use consumer purchases to have a positive effect. I don't think that's in and of itself bad. I think that sometimes has good effects and all, but I do think that it is systematically self-deceptive about the ability to escape from this. And I think that NGOs running campaigns are part of not part of a political solution always. Sometimes that might happen because they're sort of fragmented and there's this proliferation of lots of kind of semi-politics, almost politics here and there that doesn't come together very well in larger scale politics. And I don't, you asked, is it maturation in a sense? Is it people growing up from a naive anti-politics into recognizing they need to do something? And my answer is yes and no. I think there is a lot of growing out of naivete. I said, I think earlier, my experience of the humanitarian field is over beer at night, everybody is intensely self-critical of this. Nobody stays that kind of ethical purist long in this field. People cycle through for a year or two, get disappointed, leave, or they begin to develop more, quote, realist orientations to this and to the limits of what can be done, and they work within it in various ways. The field as a whole is changing by the entrance of lots of people with master's degrees in humanitarian action from the LSE and other places, and not always for the better. That is, the field was composed of people who went into it sideways for a long time, like the doctor who just decided he really wanted to go work with people in the Congo or something. People who are working in development assistance. I mean, part of the story is there were big development assistance programs, shade over to the next question, that lost support in the 70s and 80s, and people who had worked in development often began to work in humanitarian assistance. The amount of money available for emergency response went up at a time when the amount of money available for development assistance went down throughout all of the OECD countries and at the UN. And so there's a shift. At the UN, agencies which had a pure development remit, like UNDP, United Nations Development Program, began to say, well, we do emergency response too. And so a variety of different agencies also began to do that because there were resources and there was an organizational imperative for it and so forth. And so a lot of this is not maturation in the sense of people becoming better, it's literally maturation. People get older, they have mortgages, they have families to support, they keep their jobs. They keep their jobs by getting money from one source or another, keeping the agency going. And so it's maturation in that less attractive sense in a way, and they may become cynical or they may remain idealistic, but they're sort of maneuvering through that. And this relates to then the broad issue of what happened to development. One part of that, Mark Duffield makes clear, is the securitization. And I am essentially saying the same things happening in humanitarian settings, only it's more destructive of the humanitarian project even than of development. That the securitization is so at odds with the the idealized self-understanding of humanitarians like the International Committee of the Red Cross. I mean, think about the Red Cross from the Battle of Soliferino through to today, dedicated to helping all those who suffer collateral damage in war in a neutral fashion. It is absolutely not working with the military entirely, though it's working in a tacit agreement, don't shoot us. And the securitization that goes on in many ways sort of undercuts the premise of the completely neutral idealistic humanitarian field. It doesn't undercut the premise of development, it just changes development, how it works, who it works for, what happens. And in both cases, the Duffield critique of how these worlds of seemingly idealistic voluntary action are being harnessed to a global security agenda, it seems to me is right, that there is this sort of securitization. There has been for several years. It is becoming wider spread and organizing more things, and that includes what's happening in this world. And what I would say is it stops being humanitarian assistance. It becomes emergency response, but emergency response under different ideological understandings of why we're responding and what we're doing. It becomes now a security response. It becomes, if we don't respond to this crisis, tens of thousands of people will flee as refugees. They will then try to get across the Mediterranean and come into Europe, and we don't want those people coming into Europe. We need to enforce our borders, so we need to respond to the original crisis. That's not a humanitarian response, it's a self-interested response, and there's a lot of that around, and there are other versions of that security response. Syria, good case for that, as Syria in many ways becomes productive of international flows of forced migrants and collateral damage in other countries as Hezbollah decides to take sides, and we get more and more of this. So, noting that I'm not an expert on Syria in any sense, here's my short take on this. Ideology and media do intervene in Syria in big ways. And one of the ways they intervene is that Syria gets interpreted, even to this day, but certainly a lot in the first couple of years of the conflict, as though it's a Western movie, and there are people with white hats and there are people with black hats. And the good guys have the white hats, and why aren't we getting in there and helping the good guys? And that's an extraordinarily reductionist story of Syria. You don't have to be any friend of Hafez Assad to say that there are not simply good guys and bad guys. And this is the same story repeated in lots of countries, but Syria is a really extreme case. The tragedy of Syria is partly that there aren't just two sides. There aren't just bad guys and good guys. There are very complicated alignments and shifting alignments, and there's no way to simply intervene on the side of the good guys and not cause lots of collateral problems. So I'm somewhat relieved that so far no major Western power has directly intervened on the side of the putative good guys, even though some of them may be more good. I mean, I'm not disputing that they're good guys. There's no side that is made up of the purely good against the purely bad. There are religious divisions, there are regional divisions, families, brother against brother, and I mean, it's not like it gets looking. So the media participates in a way of presenting this, as it did throughout the Arab Spring and so forth, that is influenced literally by those Hollywood movies and the idea that there are sides and that you want to back the winners, or the World War II movies, or any of the others that are based on an era in which there often were clear sides in conflicts, though even then it's an ideological reading of that era. And so that's one part. And that gets then caught up with the side taking among non-combatants. Well, Russia is selling these weapons, therefore we should sell weapons too. And this is then a larger political economy overlaid on it, which has relatively little to do with the specifics of Syria and a lot to do with other conflicts, but it's going to get played out with Syrian blood and potentially damage to Turkey and other places around it. And I think that that's an issue. Third, the notion that I called the humanitarian, the emergency imaginary, figures. I don't think it's determinative or central, but it sort of figures this idea that this is sudden, unpredictable, that it can be short-term. It's been going on for years already. It's going to go on for years more. The Syrian state is sufficiently destabilized now that there is no possible short-term solution. There's no putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. So some version of bad stuff is going to continue to go on for quite a long time. And you can say that therefore there should have been a decisive intervention sooner, if you know exactly what that should be. I don't. Or you have to look at this as necessarily long-term in a way that the ideology occludes. But then that's true of, say, Egypt, in a less extreme and less violent way too. The idea, oh, well, there's going to be a complete end to all the bad versions of regimes in Egypt in the space of a few months, and then the good people will win, and we find out, well, no, it's a long process, it's complicated, other people come to power that we weren't expected, which was, you know, true in Russia and the revolution, it was true in other settings. These are never so short-term, they're never so unexpected, they're never so sudden. We may not know what's going to happen, but we usually have a lot of early warnings that stuff is happening and that things grow. There are occasions where that's not true, but they are less dominant. That's my best effort on Syria. And thank you all. These were really terrific questions. Thank you.